Hello, everybody. It's me, Shannon LaBruyere. I am alive and loving it this Sunday Night Live, and I hope you are as well. Thank you for joining me as we kind of wind up our weekend of rest and relaxation. At least I hope you had a weekend full of rest and relaxation, whatever your weekend held. Now is the time for us to start shifting gears, right? Tomorrow, Monday, we're gonna get all suited up and get all professional and go out there and change the world. And sometimes that can be a little bit daunting. And so that's why I'm here, because I want you to be able to start your week with confidence, with some encouragement, with a plan. So welcome and thank you for joining Sunday Night Live. It's a pleasure to have you here. Now, the last couple of weeks, I didn't realize I was starting a series, but I sort of have. So I want to remind you of the three, oh, hi Joanne, glad to have you. 2 weeks ago, so 2 Sundays ago, we talked about the 3 things that have to be in place for us to grow. And then last week, we kind of explored one of those topics, and we talked about how important it is for us to own our growth. So tonight's topic is going to be based on the assumption that you're doing those things. Phil, hi, I can tell you are doing those things because you jumped in. Thank you for being here. So glad to have you. Bermuda Bob, always a pleasure. I'm so glad you're jumping in. It's fun seeing everybody pop in. And I know, Bob, you're in a warmer climate. I'm here in the, what is it, the Midwest? The North Midwest? I'm in Michigan, and we've got 50-mile-an-hour winds out there, and people are acting as if it's the apocalypse. It's ridiculous. But it is windy and the trees are swaying. So, I mean, got to be careful out there, but it's nothing like Florida. You know, we can tough this out, Michiganders. Suck it up. All right. Oh, I do not have a New York accent, but I know you would recognize it. Bermuda Bob is from New York. Me, not so much. So if I accidentally slid one in, I can't claim to be a New Yorker, just a Midwesterner. Does tings. Oh, geez. We're going to have to get the lexicon, Bob, of what New Yorkers talk like. All right, so tonight we're going to jump in. And this is what I wanted to talk to you about. If you are growing, or if you go to any training sessions, we've heard this phrase all over the place, and I want to kind of dissect it tonight. The phrase is this: if you're going to grow, you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Give me a thumbs up if you have heard somebody say that. You know what? You're just going to have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I've heard it 1,000 times. And it's not a bad phrase. It's really not. But there's a better one, and I want to clue you in to what it is and why it matters so much. So, you guys know I don't have the strongest history of being an athlete, right? So I don't have athletic tendencies. Until now, I have not been a person who embraced moving around in physical activity. But not too long ago, a friend and I signed up for it was called an Extreme Inflatable 5K. So has anybody done a 5K? I think that's around 3 miles. I might be doing the math wrong on that. But it's not a long race, and usually 5Ks, most of the people who are in them are not there to try and beat everybody else. They're trying to beat their own time. So my friend Erin and I started this, we joined this inflatable 5K, and so I got out my athletic shoes, and they are Nikes, and they're very old. I've had them for a while, but I don't do a lot of moving, so it didn't matter. So I put my shoes on, and we get ready to start this 5K. And about 3 seconds into this 5K, my toe starts to bother me. Just a little bit. My toe was uncomfortable, all right? It was uncomfortable. And so I pretty much put it out of my mind. I didn't want to be a baby. I don't want to be a sissy, right? I mean, I've We've just started this race. So I carried on. And so an inflatable 5K, if you've never been a part of one, there are like giant moonwalk devices that you bounce through, or you crawl through these big inflated tunnels. Maybe a giant slide that you climb up, and then you slide down the other side and then continue on the 5K race. So I'm doing all of this crazy activity, and eventually I forget about my toe. It just didn't bother me anymore. You might say I got comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I finished the race. Woohoo! We got our free t-shirt. We rejoiced. We sat down at the picnic table, and I took off my shoe, and I no longer had a big toenail. I should have listened when I was uncomfortable. I was doing something I'd never done before, and it was very uncomfortable, and I should have investigated a little bit further. Oh, I love that heart. Thanks. And Luke, thanks for being here. Nina, so glad you jumped on. Yeah, I got too comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's the problem. I shouldn't say the problem. That's the issue with the word uncomfortable. It's a red flag for us. Think about when your body's uncomfortable. Isn't that like the red flag that's waving saying, Shannon, look at your foot. Check your foot, Shannon. Check your foot. It's uncomfortable. See what's going on. It sends off an alarm in our system, in our psyche. We're uncomfortable. And what do we want to do when we are uncomfortable? If you're uncomfortable, what is the first thing that you want to do when you're uncomfortable? Get comfortable, right? We're human. We don't love being uncomfortable. So the first thing we want to do when we are uncomfortable is try to squirm out of it. We want to get comfortable. That's our first response. I talked a couple weeks ago about Abraham Maslow, who had this brilliant phrase that I just love. He says that we are always seeking to either step forward into growth or backward into safety. We choose every time. We either step forward into growth or backward into safety. And when we're thinking, oh my gosh, I am uncomfortable, we want to be comfortable. Lynn says she loves comfort. Amen to that. We are wired for comfort. So when we say it's like get comfortable being uncomfortable, I don't know that that's necessarily the best advice, because discomfort triggers that desire for comfort. And then we're just constantly wanting to feel a little better about what's going on. Stephen, thanks for jumping on. It's glad to have you here. All right, so if we're not going to say we're going to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, what could be a better word that might serve us better when we're approaching new situations? Because any one of us, if we are growing, we are in a new place, right? We are somewhere we've never been. We are perhaps feeling, we label it, uncomfortable. Ugh, I don't like this. It's itchy. Are you allergic to wool? Anybody allergic to wool? And if it gets by your skin, it just is so itchy all the time. Uncomfortable. That's what the word stirs up in us. How about this word instead? What happens if instead, when you grow, instead of when you've grown and you're doing something new and you're in a new situation, instead of saying, oh, I'm so uncomfortable, what if you said, this is so unfamiliar? Because a lot of times, it's not that we're uncomfortable. We've just never been here before, right? And the word uncomfortable puts all the focus on how we're feeling and how do we fix it, or how do we resist it? Because if we want to grow and we've decided we're uncomfortable, we're going to grow anyway, now we've got all this energy being put into resisting the urge to get comfortable. Does that make sense? But when we take a look at our situation as a growing person who's changing and thriving and maybe getting promoted at work or exploring new relationships in our social realms, who knows? Whatever area we're growing in, if we can take a look and say, you know what? This is unfamiliar. Now we're not focusing on what we're missing, what we're doing wrong, how we're feeling, how negative it feels. We're focusing on one thing. This is unfamiliar. I need to get more familiar, right? Hi, Jason. Glad you're here. When we label what we experience as we grow as uncomfortable, we give ourselves a whole bunch of negative options that we can go down, these negative rabbit holes that suck all of our productive energy. But when we recognize that, we're in the midst of change and it's unfamiliar, that leaves us with one positive option. Let's explore, how can I get more familiar? And Bob says, as the Borg says, resistance is futile. Isn't that the truth? Some changes, resistance is futile. It's Laura. You can tell I don't have the right glasses on today. Laura, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so replacing the word uncomfortable as we're growing with the word unfamiliar empowers us instead of putting us in this negative mindset that says, I've got something to overcome. Jason, I'm glad you're here. Uncomfortable, many, many ways to interpret that, and many of them are negative. And certainly our first flag is that it's negative, and then we start to resist. When we say something's unfamiliar, it ignites a whole different response in us. This is unfamiliar. It's hopeful. Oh, it's unfamiliar, but I have an opportunity to get more familiar, right? So now that negative energy gets transmuted into something far more positive. I can pursue becoming more familiar. Hi, Laura. I'm glad you're here. All right. So unfamiliar says to us, this is new, but being in an unfamiliar place is normal. It's understandable. And so we are less judgy about ourselves, and it is far less scary. Nobody wants to be uncomfortable, and that can trigger some fear. I'm not saying that growth isn't always comfortable, but what I am saying is that we can choose to assess where we're at and decide, am I truly uncomfortable, or is this really just unfamiliar? And give ourselves a little bit of a break. Give ourselves an opportunity to reframe that. So here's an example. Working with somebody who was recently promoted, and they said to me, I'm not comfortable being a leader. Well, you're not comfortable being a leader because you've never been a leader. It's not a matter of comfortable, it's a matter of familiarity. Timely word for me. Oh, I'm glad to hear that, Laura. Yeah, it's unfamiliar. And when we give ourselves permission to explore an unfamiliar situation, just like you would if you were in a new town or a new city, and maybe that's the change that you've just been facing. When we say unfamiliar, we give ourselves permission to explore, to find out what's going on. How about this one? I'm unfamiliar, or I'm uncomfortable speaking in front of groups of people. Well, that is probably true, but you can also look at that as knowing I'm unfamiliar with doing it because I've never done it. Now, if you've done it 1,000 times and you're still uncomfortable, that's legit. So I'm not saying that you'll never be uncomfortable when you're growing. All I'm saying is the default can be much more positive when we shift that default to this is unfamiliar and this is new, right? Giselle, woohoo, love all those hearts, and I'm glad to see you. All right, how about this scenario? Walking in, or you go into the accounting department, you're brand new there, you've never been, and then you say to yourself, you know what? I am uncomfortable with the procedures here in this accounting department. Well, are you uncomfortable with the procedures, or are you unfamiliar with them? if you're uncomfortable with the procedures, it's good to check in, because it may very well be that your intuition is saying, like my toe, look here, something not right here. This is messed up. Maybe it's unethical. Maybe it's just a procedure that's got a built-in flaw. So sometimes being uncomfortable with something when we're in a new situation is that red flag that we've got to pay attention to. It's waving for a reason. So I'm not saying that you'll never be uncomfortable. I'm saying you can be in tune with what's going on. Are you uncomfortable with what's going on, or is it new and it's unfamiliar? And if that's the case, then there is so much more positive stuff that you can do that's going to get you ahead and help you to reach your goals. So that's your basic swap. When I did Weight Watchers, we were all about food swaps, right? So, you know, if you were going to use, you know, a thick slice of Velveeta cheese on your hamburger, your half-pound hamburger with the big slice of Velveeta cheese and the giant onion roll, Weight Watchers said, how about you swap that out, and you could make it better if you used a different kind of a roll, and maybe you used ground sirloin instead of hamburger, and then you could get some of the thinner sliced cheese that is lower in fat, and you would have a delicious burger without all of the added junk. That's how I'm looking at this word swap. Try swapping out uncomfortable and put in its place the word unfamiliar, and see how that impacts the way you approach your changes. Food for thought, says Jason. I like that though. Yes. What would happen if? And try it and see. Try it and see what happens when you reframe I'm uncomfortable in this change to this change is unfamiliar. As we get more practice with that, it develops our resilience muscles. We don't get as stuck as often. The words that we use when we talk to ourselves and when we talk to others definitely have meaning, and they definitely are wired to things in our brain. So it's not a small thing to swap out a word like uncomfortable for unfamiliar. It actually is a huge step toward programming yourself to be forward thinking, to explore your options, to investigate what's new and what's going on, instead of programming yourself to fight, to resist the urge for comfort if we're doing something that we know is good for us. So that's all I've got, you guys. Tonight was a short one. What, I have like 17 minutes or 18 minutes we've had. Any comments? How have you labeled some of the situations in your life as uncomfortable, and could you give yourself a little bit more room for grace, if you will, for yourself, if you were to say, you know what, it's normal. I've never done this job before. I've never been in this role before. I'm going to explore it. I'm going to get more familiar. And the promise of using the word unfamiliar tells us that there is hope for it to be familiar, right? So it's got a call for us. Bonnie, I'm glad you jumped on. Thanks for being here. We are talking about taking that word uncomfortable when we're in the midst of growth and change and substituting the word unfamiliar. When we're growing, people tell us all the time, if you are going to grow, you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think a better swap might be to say, if you're planning to grow, you need to get comfortable with the unfamiliar. Get comfortable with the unfamiliar and see what impact that has. If this adds value to you, what I'm doing here on Sunday Night Live, share it with your friends. Let them know that it's happening. You can always tag them when the video starts, but you can also share it. Share it to somebody's timeline, or just share it on your timeline. I'm always so honored when people do that. Okay, Luke, let's see what Luke's got to share here. Sometimes others can make you feel uncomfortable. For me, that is where I adapt the resistance. Yeah, other people can often make us feel uncomfortable. Yep. And it's good to be able to identify that, isn't it? to know that, okay, this is a whole different dynamic happening here. These are the people pieces. But sometimes they're uncomfortable because you are unfamiliar. It all depends. Luke, if you had more to share about that, I'd be curious of a scenario where a specific that you encountered that, because it would help me to understand a little bit more what you mean. I was thinking about some of the times when I am most uncomfortable are the times when there are other people involved and I have never met them. I was just thinking about that today. I had some great opportunities last week for some great partnerships, but I had to have the talk with myself. Okay, Shannon, you're not uncomfortable. This is new and it's unfamiliar. You're going to be okay. You know how to behave in public, right? Right, Shannon? You know how to have a conversation. You know how to be a good listener. None of this is anything that you're not comfortable doing in a familiar situation. So don't worry about doing it in an unfamiliar situation. A lot of times the skills that we use, we're still using those same skills, but because we're in a new place, we're all of a sudden uncomfortable. We can look to the things that are familiar about it and encourage ourselves with that. You can tell I'm getting ready to take a drink. Hold on. So thank you, Luke, for sharing. Anybody else, throw them in the comments. I'm going to wrap this up, but I always stay on there and I try to greet everybody, and I also love to hear what you have to say because it gives me food for thought. And you probably noticed by now, if you've tuned into Sunday Night Live at all, is a lot of the lessons I teach you are lessons that I'm learning myself, that I've actually had to exercise and grow in myself. And that's how I learned them, and that's why I share them with you. And that's where this one is coming from. Christine, I'm so glad you jumped on. Just a quick summary of what we talked about. A lot of times we think we have to be uncomfortable to grow, and that we have to plan to be uncomfortable, and that immediately triggers us to go looking for comfort. And if we reframe our new situation and say, oh, you know what, it's not that I'm uncomfortable in this new growth situation, this new job that I just got because I've been growing and improving. It's not that I'm uncomfortable, it's that I'm unfamiliar. And instead of all the focus being on our emotion that's attached to the change, that uncomfortable, this is different, you know, where our focus goes, our energy flows, right? So when we focus on we are uncomfortable, we make a couple of choices. We either start to ignore it, and sometimes that is not good, or we power through it, but powering through it takes so much of our focus off of the positive things because we're just trying to manage the negative that, you know what, I know I've got to do this even though I don't want to. It's going to be hard, but I'm going to make it, and it takes a lot of energy. When we say, you know what, I'm in an unfamiliar situation, it inspires us to pursue something good. It inspires us to explore, and it cues our brain to do something totally different than try to find comfort. I'm uncomfortable, I want to get comfortable. Or I'm in an unfamiliar place, I want to find out more. The solution that our brain always wants to being uncomfortable is to get more comfortable. And getting more comfortable is not always the best solution because we know that growth can feel a little bit challenging. It can be uncomfortable. When we identify things as being unfamiliar, it gives us the option of solving the problem by doing something positive. So that's what we're talking about. Uncomfortable is a word that's appropriate many times. Unfamiliar is often even more appropriate, and that's where we want to spend our time. If we can know that what we're feeling is discomfort, not because we're uncomfortable and in pain, but because it's unfamiliar and there's hope for us to be able to explore and grow, it changes everything. Laura, I am so glad you jumped on. Luke, thanks for sharing. Jason, keep thinking. Giselle, always fun to see your hearts. Phil, I'm trying to think of everybody else who popped on. Thanks. I'm honored that you dropped in. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to talking to you next week on Sunday Night Live. Take care. Mwah.